Martin from the Travel Trade Consultancy here. It's a pleasure to be joining you. I'm going to try and set the scene and set out how I think we move forward from the point we currently find ourselves. Setting the scene, of course, is really virtually impossible at the moment because the scenery keeps moving. There are two major issues that will define a generation, and as the year draws to an end, we're still basically no further forward, and we have very little idea how these things will play out. I think the only place we can really start is the vaccine. And I want to just spend a bit of time just talking about my view of how I think that's going to impact the travel sector. There's no doubt that the vaccine news has been fantastic news for the travel sector, as well as humanity at large. Look, I am genuinely an optimist, believe it or not. I think having been a Sunderland fan for 40 years, you get to know a thing or two about looking on the bright side of life. And clearly I'm not an epidemiologist at all, but looking at the efforts that the scientific community have gone through to move heaven and earth to create a usable vaccine in the short time frame, it's been astonishing. Unfortunately, though, those diligent professional scientists now have to hand the baton on to our government to execute the next phase of that, and that's where I fear we may well see some problems. There are plenty of unanswered questions. Ultimately that will affect how quickly the pandemic can be brought to an end by this vaccine. And I do think it's dangerous to place too much hope at this point on the vaccine alone. Firstly, I think you have to remember that the vaccine treats the symptoms of COVID and it doesn't stop you spreading it. And so whilst that's great news and clearly a priority for treating the most vulnerable in society and bringing down the death rate and the hospital rate and what have you, that alone is not going to put us in a position that we can start traveling freely again in the near term. Because what you have to remember is the spread of cases, and specifically the introduction of new cases into a host country that we're traveling to, that is keeping the borders closed and restricted, and that's what's driving these current requirements. I think for me, for the vaccine alone to have a meaningful impact on the ability to travel, there's really two parts to this. Firstly, I think we need some sort of we need sufficient coverage to get to enough of the population to reach this famous mythical herd immunity we've heard so much about. And the second is that we need some sort of universally accepted means of proving that somebody has been vaccinated in order to allow them into the country. I think, getting to herd immunity, that's the product of a few things, isn't it? It's the product of the vaccine's effectiveness. It's the level of uptake, and it's also just the success in the logistical effort of getting the vaccine into the arms of as many people as possible. We've heard great news about the levels of efficacy from the various vaccines that have been released so far. But I think when it comes to the other aspects of this, when we're looking at the rollout, for example, and the logistics, we're talking about the rollout of something on an absolutely unprecedented scale. I think even if you are prepared to overlook the missteps of recent years, of major government projects, from track and trace to getting PPE equipment into the hands of the people who need it on the front line, even to things like awarding ferry contracts this time last year when we were staring down the barrel, the previous time we were staring down the barrel of a hard Brexit. I don't think you have to be that much of a government skeptic to see that it's unlikely to be plain sailing. When you look at the efforts involved, just covering the most vulnerable in society in care homes, the key workers and the elderly, that already is about 17 million people. I also think the rollout is going to be hugely complicated by what you might call the vaccine hesitant. I mean, one study published by Cambridge University just a couple of weeks ago put the proportion at somewhere between 15 and 20% of people who are unwilling or at that stage were unwilling to take a vaccine because of suspicions. Now, admittedly, that survey was back in October before the most recent news. But I think, that could be a whole range of different reasons behind that, but it's clearly going to be complicated. And I think the third aspect of the proof that might be needed to be able to prove that you have been vaccinated, again, it feels to me like we're some way off this. There doesn't seem to be any real sign that there's anything being planned from a government level. I think, again, you have to remember that there are over 250 vaccines in various stages of production around the world. And, all of those have different levels of efficacy, protection, and so on. So just purely for getting to a herd immunity perspective, from my reading of things, realistically, I think it's the third quarter of the year, I think, before the vaccine has propagated enough into society and enough people have been inoculated that we really have sufficient coverage. Just going on to this second point, like I say, there are 250 different vaccines in varying stages of testing around the world, and they will need some sort of standardized approach to be able to verify that you've taken the right vaccine and you can indeed come into the country. I think if we don't have that, there is this real danger that the vaccine you end up taking is the medical equivalent of the Betamax video, and no one's willing to accept you into their country. So in my most optimistic case, like I say, I don't see the vaccine having a material effect on the logistics of people actually traveling until summer at the earliest, but more likely Q3 or Q4. But that's not to say that it's not vitally important that the vaccine news and the rollout occurs. I think it will provide this short-term boost purely from a confidence point of view. As more and more of the most vulnerable in society get vaccinated, clearly the need for government to lock us down and to really close down using the various tier systems, that starts to be eliminated. And I think what we should see is a move. Dr. Fauci in the US has referred to this idea of a gradual accrual of more normality as the weeks and months go by. And the one thing that we are seeing, we'll touch on this a little bit later, is that the vaccine news is driving confidence amongst the public. And so hopefully that will continue. But from my reading of things, in the short term, what's more important really is testing. If you're lucky enough to be going to any one of these three countries, for example, over Christmas, you will see that there are already inbound testing regimes in place. And again, I think the testing rules and the testing changes that come into force actually today, reducing the requirement for quarantine, certainly are helpful. I think the problem that we see, though, is that there's still this very fragmented approach. And what we need is something much more coordinated. So just looking at the travel trade press over the last couple of weeks, all of these different organizations have announced some form of their own testing regime that they will introduce either on their service or going through their airport. And I think that's the problem, is that in the absence of any sort of coordinated government approach, it's the idea that mutual recognition is going to be much harder to come by. I think it's the receiving country that bears all of the risk, and so ultimately it's them that needs to be satisfied that the testing regime is valid and to an acceptable standard. And so that's going to take coordination between nations that so far we haven't seen much sign of. Some talk about a bilateral agreement between the UK and Spain, for example, but that's going to really need to be stepped up. So ancillary danger for me is that now that the government has had this very positive news around vaccine, and they talk about the cavalry coming over the hill, they may well see that as a reason to pull back their efforts on organising and spending money on a coordinated testing approach if they see that this is the beginning of the end. Like I say, I think the changes to quarantine rules, the general rule that quarantine goes from 14 days down to 10 days, and in addition, this idea that you can take a private test on day 5, and should you pass that test, you no longer need to quarantine. I think that will clearly have an impact, and anecdotal evidence that is already happening. But there's further speculation that the rule or the need to quarantine will disappear almost entirely early next year as the levels of inoculation of the vaccine rollout to the most vulnerable people happens. And I think that's clearly what we need to aim for. So for now, I think there should be no let up from our industry in pushing for coordination and pushing for this testing regime. Of course, COVID and the pandemic are really only one of the unresolved generation-defining catastrophes that we're living through at the moment. Brexit is still clearly a mess. We're now deep into stoppage time in the negotiations, and really it's too difficult to call. Barely believable that with little more than 15 days, we're still messing around with fishing rights and what have you. Brexit issues are going to be clearly covered a lot more over the course of today's events. If you haven't already, quick plug, if you haven't already downloaded our free Brexit risk matrix that can help you work through some of the issues and just help you plan for some of the consequences, please go ahead and grab that. The link is on the bottom of the slide there. You can even download that now and fill that in as you go, and just make sure that you're putting yourself in the best position and identifying all of the issues. So the question I think it's obvious to ask is, how are customers behaving through all of this? Looking at the data on travel websites is something we've talked about previously. These are heat maps that they measure the increase or decrease in the activity on particular travel vertical websites. And now it's not actual bookings; it's more the number of hits. So it's an intention to book. It's an interesting proxy, I think, for what customers are thinking and what they're planning. And I think what's been really interesting is tracking this data all the way back to the very start of this whole situation, back at the end of March. And you can really see how the various announcements and the twists and turns of the pandemic have impacted customer behavior. Here's just a few, for example, that you could look at. So back on the 10th of July, for example, when the government made their first announcements around travel corridors. Prior to that, you could see that tour operators on the top line had been trading or experiencing website hits of, down to 75% down on their normal levels, and definitely saw an instant pickup, somewhere around 20 percentage points improvement when that initial announcement of safe travel corridors was announced. Fast forward to various points during the intervening period up to August, where you can see that things steadily declined as countries, particularly Spain, went back onto the naughty step. But you could then move to somewhere like October, where Canary Islands were added to the list. And again, you see this instant jump from somewhere around 70% down to 55% down, an instant pickup. Just the most recent data we have, really just over the last 3 weeks, I think is interesting, because you can see in that week beginning the 9th of November, when the very first announcement of the vaccine testing and efficacy rates came out, and there was a lot of really positive news stories around that. It didn't actually really move the needle, pardon the pun, didn't really move the dial too much on holiday bookings or holiday interest at that point, but only around 10 percentage points. So not as much as, say, the Canary Islands coming onto the travel corridors list did. But then you look at the most recent week of the 23rd of November, and actually that was the week when the testing results, or rather the regulatory approval was given for the vaccine. And actually, we already started to see some movement around, the vaccine being lined up and people being given appointments and what have you. That had a seemingly much bigger impact, a much more improved result. And fingers crossed, we'll see that when the next weeks ahead start to come out, that we'll see that continually improve. Just a couple of other things worth just touching on. That very top line there is tour operators. But actually, if you look at some of the other travel verticals in there, you can see that cruise lines, for example, have had it very tough throughout this situation, but again, have seen a little early flickers of recovery just in the most recent weeks. And you would expect that, given the likely demographic and a big overlap between those who are most likely to be first in line for picking up the vaccines. I think another one that's interesting is car rental. You can see that actually car rental has had a fairly, in the early stages was down as much as tour operators, but really ever since the early summer has only been about a third down, which substantially outperforms a lot of other travel verticals. I think there's a number of reasons that might be. It could be partly that car rental companies, this reflects maybe domestic car hire rather than necessarily holiday car hire. So that could be one aspect. I think another thing, though, could well be in this data is that a response from customers who are less willing to use public transport or take group transfers, for example, and are looking to really manage their own travel, from between airports and destinations. And so if that is a trend that continues, it could really represent an opportunity going forward, I think, to make sure that car hire is added and offered within your products. So I think there's many unanswered questions that we'll really start to look at over the coming weeks. And I've just picked out 3 that I think are worth pondering. I think the first one for me is, what is January going to look like? I should say that these questions really, depending on which sector that you find yourself in, and clearly today is largely around the sort of specialist sectors, but whichever sector you find yourself in, I think these questions will have a greater or lesser impact. But certainly January is such a pivotal month, certainly for the summer bookings, summer holiday market, European beach holiday market. Those guys would normally expect to sell anything up to 20% of their holidays by the end of January. It's so important for cash flow as well as resource planning and all those sorts of things. And so a booking curve might typically look something like that, where you get this big spike in January and then a steady increase and then a bit of a late market towards the summer. I think that realistically, we're going to see a totally different booking curve this year. I think realistically, it looks something more like this. I think a much quieter January as people take in the news and people are less willing to make commitments in this fairly uncertain time period. Certainly that's something we've seen throughout the summer, is that customers will just delay making decisions when there is uncertainty. But I think we'll see something much more like this stepped profile, because again, what we've seen over the last 8 months, and no reason to think this won't continue, is customers reacting to events and reacting to news. And so when countries are added or taken off the corridor list, or when inevitably there will be some bumps along the road with the vaccine rollout, for example, I think we'll see customers respond in fits and starts to those sorts of events. And of course, holiday prices are intrinsically linked to those booking values. And so a slow January start or this dislocated sort of booking profile will cause some of the operators, particularly those larger operators who have big commitments, to panic around pricing. And that starts to have an impact on the whole market. So really interesting how this all pans out. And I think, coping with this totally different booking profile to what we're normally used to, I think is the first big question. Second question I flagged really is, I think, the impact of business travel. Business travel, there's a lot been written about this, and I know we don't have too many travel management companies today, so I'm not going to dwell on their business model, but I think lots of estimates that business travel could be down across the board by a fifth to a third of a normal year. And that's a challenge that those guys will have to deal with. But I think that has such a knock-on effect and implications for the rest of outbound leisure, actually, because the unit economics of an aircraft really rely on that business travel to drive a huge amount of their profitability. So if you look at in a typical year, and this data is taken from the most recent full calendar year we have, 2019, business travel is around 10 to 12% of outbound passengers from the UK. But the fares are usually significantly higher yielding. So business travelers will pay much larger sums for the same seat to buy that flexibility. And so whilst there might only be 10 to 12% of the passengers, it might represent up to, depending on the airline, up to 50% of the profitability of that particular airline. Now, visiting friends and relatives, and it's another very clearly separate demographic, if you like, of traveller. That is somewhere around 25% of the overall carriage in a plane. And again, you would expect that there will be such pent-up demand from people wanting to visit friends and relatives that it might offset some of that from a passenger numbers perspective, might offset some of that drop in business travel. But the fact is that people visiting friends and relatives just don't pay the same fares and won't pay for that same level of flexibility. So the unit economics of the aircraft change, which means that every other seat has to be priced differently to make up for that shortfall. And you will see airlines starting to look at ways to make up the difference. It could be one of the reasons, for example, in EasyJet's policy announced just a couple of weeks ago to start charging a different fee structure for onboard baggage. The final thing I want to talk about is really the channel shift that we've witnessed over the last year. There are lots of customer habits that have changed over this COVID period. Some of them really positive for our sector and provide opportunities, and some slightly more difficult. One trend that I'm pondering, though, I think is that in general retail, so across all customer spending, COVID has dramatically accelerated this channel shift to online. So you can see from this chart that customers have been moving online in general retail spend around about 1 to 2 percentage points per year over the last decade or more. But what we've seen in the last 8 months is this huge jump, this huge channel shift, equating to around 5 years jump in one short period. Now that's across demographics as well. That's people of all age groups. Often people who wouldn't previously have dreamt of moving online. People have moved to online shopping and grocery shopping and discovered that actually it works quite well. And they may never go back to the traditional route of shopping. I think travel has or had been experiencing the same sort of gradual shift online. But I think given what's gone on over the last 8 months, I think there's a strong case for it going in the opposite direction, actually. I think if you factor in that consumer media has been very negative for many travel brands, actually, but really the online travel agents who've performed, I think, the most poorly. That's because of a whole range of reasons, but partly because there is that no relationship to fall back on. There's no one that consumer can really call to understand their challenges and understand why their refunds aren't being processed or whatever. I think the second thing, though, is the complexity, and some of that we've talked about for the foreseeable future, whether it's the different testing requirements and documentation requirements for different destinations. I think you can make a strong case for consumers wanting to go back to dealing directly with human beings. And again, that's great for certainly everybody in the room today. I think on top of these big sector-wide questions, the in-tray is already looking pretty full for business owners for 2021. Here's just a few things coming our way over the next few months. Like at the heart of everything, number one is to not run out of cash. And clearly, if you can achieve that, then you can probably cope with most of the others. There's a huge amount to get through, I think, early next year. Firstly, just picking out some of these other ones. Customers, travel businesses have got to pick up the pieces, I think, with their customer relationships and their supplier relationships, but also dealing with employee issues. As the furlough scheme comes to an end, what that looks like in terms of bringing employees back into the business. And so the last one I'll just mention here. Finally, I think there's some really big regulatory issues to resolve. I know we're going to touch on this in a bit more detail in the coming sessions, but the Air Travel Trust Scheme effectively has run out of money. As of November, there was about £35 million of cash left in there. But the CAA is also estimating that the 25 or so failures that have happened just since the start of this pandemic will cost them around that 35 million. So effectively, that wipes out the money that was left in the fund. There is obviously an overdraft sitting behind the Air Travel Trust, and there's a government guarantee sitting behind that, and that's all well and good. But of course, that shifts from it being a travel sector funded scheme to now a taxpayer backed scheme. It's no longer industry money; it's taxpayers' money that's sitting behind the ATOL scheme, for example, and that will put a lot of pressure on the CAA from government to tighten things up. So, I think the CAA likely to consult in the first quarter of next year. And that's going to have some sort of serious implications, I think, for travel businesses that we'll need to get to grips with. And I'm sure we'll discuss that in a bit more detail over the coming sessions. So that's all from me for now. I think all of these issues are ahead of us, but I think right now we should really congratulate ourselves that we're still standing, because 2020 has been a brutal year, a very, very tough battle. So I really hope you all managed to take a proper break over Christmas and recharge the batteries for the difficult months ahead to come back fighting. Have a great day today. I hope you get lots out of the sessions. Wish you all a Merry Christmas and a healthy and Happy New Year.